Hey all, it's Matt, your average gamer. Today we're looking at a new Souls-like game in Liesofp. My expectation for Liesofp were relatively low, as I've had a hard time finding a Souls-like game that can match the heights of a From Software Souls game. I had heard positive things, but I wasn't sold on a game based on a few trailers or hype, so instead I decided to put several hours into the game myself, and I'm about 10 to 15 hours in now. The location is in the fictional city of Krat, and it will look familiar for Bloodborne fans. As you're going to see throughout the video, a lot of the scenery has a very Bloodborne feel to it, as it was heavily inspired by Bloodborne. In this video and review for Liesofp, we're going to go through my first 10 to 15 hours of experience throughout the game, and we're also going to go over how the combat works, how cool the weapons are, everything you need to know, the boss fights, basically everything that makes Liesofp a very good game and a really fun one to play too. Hotel Krat is a really cool place. The combat gripped me almost immediately, having a high focus on dodges and counterattacks, but the setting and music sold me even more. The main hub is Hotel Krat. Here you'll be able to do all the things you want to do in a Souls-like game to get stronger. And the central hub does its job well. Aside from a skill tree, which I'll talk about in a bit, which I wasn't a huge fan of, everything else here is pretty straightforward. You're going to be able to upgrade your weapons. You have this cool arm that you can essentially turn into more weapons. And then, of course, you can do anything that you need to do here, including level up and whatnot, that you would in a normal Souls game. It's very straightforward, and I really like the environment and the music too. You have 5 different things you can level up, and so far I've been pretty much a quality build because I've been checking out all different types of weapons, but don't worry because later in the game, I think around chapter 7 or so, you're going to be able to respec, which is a huge convenience and obviously a little bit different than Bloodborne, where we wish they would let us respec. There's also a ton of cool NPCs with better voice acting and dialogue than expected. The story itself so far is much better than I anticipated as well, and what I'm not going to go into too much here, but I do want to mention, as I stated before, is that the skill upgrades are a little bit weird as far as the skill tree goes. It's something where you're going to have to put points into it and you're going to get health flasks and stuff out of it, but so far the skill tree for me feels underwhelming and a little bit too crazy. I think they could have simplified it or done it in a better way. Everything else though, as far as Hotel Krat though, is excellent. I wanted to highlight Hotel Krat for a few minutes and show the scenery and how good the soundtrack is. Seriously, the soundtrack is awesome in Liesofp, and the setting will often remind you of a cross between Bloodborne and Bioshock. I do want to mention that there are some bugs in the game, but so far they're relatively small. I have gone through a few walls a bit on edges, and a few enemies did randomly vanish. This is so slight though, and the frame rate kept up the whole time, steady as it could be. There's really no denying that Liesofp looks great. We're going to be getting into a boss fight here soon, talking about the weapons and what you can do with them, and more. Now, real quick, I wanted to talk about the dialogue here. I think I mentioned this once already, but as far as the dialogue and the story itself, it's loosely based, obviously, on Pinocchio, but the story hasn't been bad so far. It's not something I don't think that's going to really suck you in, but it's not bad either. The story's fine enough. It goes with the setting, and the combat makes everything else great. Keep in mind, we're dealing with the Souls-like game here, so the story doesn't have to be anything phenomenal, and so far it's actually better, as I mentioned, than I would have expected, and the story has at least kept my interest throughout all the awesome fighting and the bosses and whatnot that we're going to get into. Now, you're going to see more dialogue here, but normally this is where you upgrade your weapons, and you'll be able to get enough materials to upgrade a couple weapons early on, but as the game goes on, it's going to be even easier to upgrade several different weapons, as eventually you can purchase some of the materials, and you can get an infinite amount of them. So far, there's an electric bonk stick that I really like. You can get that fairly early, by the way. That's an awesome weapon to grab, and I'm going to talk about the different damage types, but at least for me at this point, posture breaking, we're going to talk about that later, and poise breaking seems to be a big part of this game. And keep in mind, whatever you decide to start with, because you can respec later, and because of the fact that there's so much versatility in the weapons, and you can pretty much use weapons with any stats, you can try out many different things, and you're not locked behind your choice at the beginning, so don't take too long thinking about that. Pick what you feel like choosing, and you can always change it later. That being said, to sum up Hotel Krat, before we move on to a boss fight and several other different things I want to talk about, the central hub itself is really great. Aside from the skill tree, which I wasn't a huge fan of, I ended up really liking it. I think it fits the rest of the game very well. This is an area that you can access early too, and you're going to get to know everybody here. As you can see on screen, they often have a good amount of dialogue, which isn't really a bad thing given that the story is at least somewhat interesting. Now there we go as far as upgrading weapons. Everything is kept quite simple, by the way. The sword that I have equipped there is the main one I'm using, and second to that I like the electric bonk stick, which has been really good so far. These are just some of the trick weapons that are in the game. There's a ton of them so far, so many different things to choose from, and so far, at least for me, as far as the combat goes, a lot of them are quite good. As far as their natural forms, we're going to talk about what you can do with them too here in a second, but their forms themselves, when you pick them up before you alter them in any way, they all seem to be pretty good so far. Now with that said, I do want to talk about one thing that we need to talk about, is the fact that you can reassemble them into other weapons. As you can see here on screen, we're able to basically assemble anything that we want. We can mix these up, take whatever handle and then pick the weapon itself and change up the movesets for them. However, there is a massive downside to doing this. At least for me to this point in the game, every time I reassemble something, it ends up doing significantly less damage than its base version. And we're going to take a second here to actually assemble something, and when we do assemble it on screen, you're going to see that the moveset of what we end up picking changes. However, what we end up picking will usually always do less damage, and it feels like a little bit of a missed opportunity there because this is a great concept. I really like the concept of assembling these, but as far as the damage goes, it's been lackluster so far. Yeah, you'll get an entirely new move set, so that's cool. It's basically going to have the move set of whatever the handle you choose is. However, if you're actually going to take this out and use it on enemies, you're going to notice immediately, no matter what the change of the type is, that the damage is going to be less than before, which is a disappointment. Again, this is something that they could fix in a patch, though. If they patch this, this is a really cool concept. As far as the concept itself, I like it. Now, you build up posture in Liesofp. I told you earlier I was going to talk about this, and strength weapons have an advantage over dexterity in this aspect. A couple charge hits may stagger a boss, and shortly after you'll be warned by them, they'll be glowing essentially, that you can break them for a critical hit. You can test combat in Hotel Krat on these dummies, and it's actually useful for testing different weapons and seeing which ones can posture break the fastest. Poise breaking, if you're like me and you're not into parrying, is probably your best bet to take on some of the bosses in Liesofp, essentially counterattacking, dodging, and then going for charged hits to build up posture breaks and then to do a ton of damage. Now on to a boss. I included a simple one here, even though I do get beat up a fair bit. To avoid spoilers, I try to do that throughout this video, and some of the two-part bosses, because the game is relatively new. This one had a theme to it, so that was cool. One thing I hadn't realized until after this fight, you can dodge to the left to avoid a lot of attacks in Liesofp. Once I learned that, my fighting style did improve. That being said, this is a moderately easy boss, and before this one, there's a big boss that will test your patience, and that's one of a few issues I have with Liesofp. Souls-like games have the same issue when it comes to this. They all try to match the awesome Souls boss fights, and Liesofp actually does this very well for a Souls-like game, but a few of the tougher boss fights didn't have difficult movesets, but were instead given a ton of HP in comparison to your damage output to make up for the difficulty to essentially make them harder. This caused some of the fights not necessarily being hard ended up being difficult, but instead they would end up being on the longer side. During the fight against the bishop, which many have trouble with, I found myself getting a little bored late in the fight, simply dodging and counterattacking an HP bar that at times felt endless for the weapon upgrades and power we were likely given at the time. That being said, that's far and few between, and most boss fights seemed relatively fair and are a ton of fun when you get the victory. I'm currently on chapter 7, I believe there's 11 in total, and roughly 10 to 15 hours into the game. I'm really enjoying my playthrough. And you can see a posture break here for a fairly good amount of damage because we ended up building up that poise damage. By the way, the trick weapon I have, it essentially goes from a sword to a much longer reaching weapon and makes it even more convenient for bosses like this because you can essentially trap her by reaching out. The reach we have now with the charged attack is immense. Yeah, this weapon has an absurd amount of reach. Not all weapons do get to that point, but it does help when you have enemies with lower poise. Now, I did want to mention one downside that I didn't really get into much for Liesofp. And there were things that I did pick at. It's far from a perfect game. It is a lot of fun so far. But your character's poise is also non-existent. Almost any attack can knock you out of whatever you're doing, and that's a little bit of a disappointment too. I wish they would put just a little bit of poise in Lies of P. So if you're playing and you're wondering why you're getting knocked out of every little animation, it's pretty much everybody that's being knocked out of every animation. I get the whole point is like Bloodborne, you're supposed to counter attack, and if you're really good at parrying, you're supposed to do that too, but having basic enemies sometimes completely knock you out of whatever you're doing can be a little bit frustrating. And on screen here, you're going to see another bonus is that you can build up your final pulse cell, which is essentially your flask for this game. So if you're out, you can get in enough hits and you'll build up and get that last one. And you can do that several times, maybe even infinitely. I think I've only had to do it twice at most. But it basically refills upon hits and whatnot, so you can get that last health flask back. And that can really help you towards the end of some of these tough boss battles. It's kind of a neat feature that can end up saving you at the end of fights. For me, it saved me a couple of times because I would end up with, say, half health, no flask, and then I'd be able to get another pulse cell by getting enough hits in on the boss, healing up, and then finishing them off and moving on to victory. And that is something that's definitely going to help you in your journey. There's also locked doors and shortcuts, and a stargazer, aka bonfire, never feels too far away. Right when you need one, it always seems to either bring you back through a shortcut or you end up finding another one. The level design so far is pretty genius. I'm ready to make my consensus here. Lies of P is a ton of fun. It has smooth gameplay, looks good, has tough and fun boss fights with a great soundtrack. On the downside, there's minor bugs, an awkward skill tree, and some bosses that are only difficult because of combined health pools. So my final score, an 8 out of 10, and I'm going to head back to the city of Krat now and see where my adventure takes me. Have a great day and be sure to sub.